People like to believe the greatest tragedy of growing old is death. They're wrong. The most brutal tragedy is the exact moment you realize the world is slowly stripping you of your right to be a person. While you're still standing right there, your own chest still rising and falling with breath. It was 9:14 on a Tuesday morning. Warm golden light filled the toy shop, spilling over rows of little castle models lined up on cold steel shelves. I was 71 years old, a retired chief architect who had once designed some of the city's tallest towers, standing at the register with a $45 birthday gift for my granddaughter in my hands. I smiled and slid my gold credit card into the reader. The machine blinked red. "I'm so sorry, sir," the cashier said, her smile stretched into the particular shape people reserve for old men in trouble. "It says declined. Would you like to try another card?" I frowned, more puzzled than embarrassed, and pulled a second card from my wallet, the one I'd carried for 11 years, the one that had never once failed me, not at a single register in 11 years of ordinary Tuesdays. Declined. Behind me, a young man in a slate-gray suit exhaled through his nose loud and pointed, checking his watch as though my humiliation were personally costing him money he could never get back. Somewhere farther down the line, a woman murmured something to her friend, and though I couldn't make out the words, I understood the tone with perfect, sickening clarity. It was the tone people use once they've quietly decided you are no longer entirely reliable, the tone reserved for the confused, the elderly, the ones who hold up the line and apologize for it. I had $400,000 sitting in a retirement account 2 miles from where I stood. I had, in a very literal sense, helped design the very bank tower that account lived inside. My drafting table, my calculations, my signature on the structural plans 40 years before, back when Ashgate Architectural Partners still had my name stenciled on the senior partner's door. And in that moment, none of it mattered in the slightest. In the eyes of every stranger in that shop, I was no longer Vincent Holbrook, the architect. I was simply an old man who could not be trusted with a piece of plastic, a stalled gear jamming the smooth rhythm of a world that had already decided to move on without me. "It's all right," I said quietly, setting the little castle back on the counter as gently as I could manage. "I'll come back another time." I walked out into the cold morning air, past the young man who didn't bother to hide his relief at finally moving forward in line, and I sat in my car for a long moment before my hands were steady enough to work the phone. I called my son. Owen picked up on the second ring, his voice clipped and efficient, the voice of a man who bills his time in 6-minute increments, even with his own father. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" My cards were declined, both of them. A pause. Then, unmistakably, a small, patient sigh, the sigh you give a child who has asked the same question for the second time. "Right, yeah. Bianca and I consolidated everything into a family account last week. It's safer that way. You've been forgetting things lately, Dad, and with everything going on with scams targeting seniors right now, we just thought it made sense to simplify things for you. You don't need to worry about any of it anymore. You canceled my credit cards without telling me. We didn't cancel anything, we consolidated. There's a difference. If you need something, just call Bianca, and she'll take care of it same day. Honestly, Dad, it's going to be so much easier for everyone." Everyone, not me. Everyone else? I sat there gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went pale, watching ordinary people stream in and out of the shop with their bags and their unbothered mornings. And I felt something shift low in my chest. Not rage, not yet. Something colder than rage. Something that understood all at once and with total clarity that the wheel of my own life had just been quietly taken out of my hands, and that I had been the very last person told. 71 years old, and my own son had just spoken to me the way you'd speak to a toddler who'd wandered too close to a stove, patient, gentle, and completely unwilling to hear a single word I said back. He hadn't asked my opinion. He hadn't asked if I wanted help. He had simply decided quietly weeks ago that my judgment no longer counted, and then waited for a moment convenient enough to inform me of it. "I understand," I said. "Thank you, Owen." 4 words. I hung up before he could hear whatever was underneath them. A chill ran down my spine sitting there in that parking lot. The one who had just stripped me of my dignity, who had torn the steering wheel out of my own hands in broad daylight, was not some criminal lurking in a dark alley. It was the blood I had spent my entire life protecting. And the cruelest betrayal in this world, I was learning, always arrives wearing the most perfect coat, one stitched together from 4 small words. It's for your own good. If any part of this feels familiar to you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and how it's making you feel right now. Subscribe if you want to stay for the rest of it. I didn't drive home. I sat there a long while, engine off, and it was there, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular, that I thought of Corinne. My wife had spent 31 years as a senior auditor before the stroke took her from me 3 years ago. And if there was one lesson 3 decades of forensic accounting had carved into her, it was this: control follows money, not blood. She used to say it to me over coffee, half amused, half deadly serious, whenever she watched Owen's appetite for helping quietly grow year over year, long before either of us had a name for what it was becoming. "You can lend them your shoulder, Vincent," she told me once, not long before the end, sitting at our kitchen table with a mug going cold between her hands. "But you never, ever hand over the keys to the house while your mind is still standing in every room of it. Whoever holds the money writes the rules." That isn't cynicism, love. That's just the plainest arithmetic there is. I hadn't truly understood her, not until that Tuesday morning, sitting in a parking lot outside a toy shop, holding a phone that had just delivered the news that my own son had quietly rewritten the terms of my life without ever once asking my permission. I thought of the man I used to be, the one who had stood in a room of 40 engineers and defended a 500-foot cantilever against every objection thrown at it, the one who never let another living soul tell him what his own judgment was worth. And I thought of the man I had apparently become in my son's eyes. Forgetful, fragile, a liability to be managed quietly, efficiently, and, worst of all, most unforgivably, lovingly, at least in his own telling of it. That was the part that cut the deepest. Owen didn't sound like a man stealing from his father. He sounded like a man who had thoroughly convinced himself he was rescuing one. I thought, too, about Bianca, and the way she had leaned into that word, safer. At every dinner, every holiday, every quiet conversation in the kitchen, while Owen carved the turkey. "Safer for you to let us handle the bills, Vincent. Safer for you not to drive at night anymore." Safer, 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 until the word had worn a groove so deep into our family's vocabulary that no one thought to ask what, exactly, I was being kept safe from, or who, in the end, was being protected by all that safety. I started the car. My hands had finally stopped shaking, which frightened me more than the shaking had. I didn't go home. I drove straight to the bank, because 40 years of reading blueprints had taught me exactly one unbreakable rule. You never trust a structure simply because someone tells you it's sound. You go, and you look at the foundation with your own 2 eyes, no matter how much it costs you to see what's really holding the walls up. And some part of me, some old, stubborn architect's instinct that had never once been wrong about a building in 40 years, already knew that whatever I found underneath mine was not going to be an accident. What waited for me there would knock the ground out from under me a second time in the very same morning, and this time it would come with a signature attached. My signature, on a document I had never in my entire life seen before. The bank lobby smelled like the same burnt coffee it always had, and Marion Hayes, my financial advisor of 19 years, looked at me the way you look at someone standing on a ledge you can't talk them down from. She didn't ask why I'd come in without an appointment. She just stood up from her desk, said, "Give me 1 moment, Vincent," and disappeared into the back office. When she returned 3 minutes later, She was carrying a manila folder, thick enough that it needed both hands to carry properly. "I think you should sit down for this," she said. I didn't sit down. 40 years on construction sites had taught me that the men who sit down when trouble shows up are usually the ones who end up buried under it. "Just tell me, Marion." She opened the folder anyway, laying the papers out on the desk between us like evidence at a trial neither of us had asked to attend. 3 weeks ago, our office received a durable power of attorney naming Owen Holbrook as your agent. Full authority, banking, investments, real estate, the retirement account, all of it. It's notarized, it's dated, it's on file. Legally, as far as this bank is concerned, Owen has had authority to act on your behalf since the 22nd of last month. I stared at the paper. There, at the bottom, was my name in my own handwriting, the particular slant of my V, the way I always let the final E in Holbrook trail off, a little too long, a habit 40 years of blueprints had never quite corrected. It was, without any question I could argue against, my signature. I had never signed anything like it in my life. "That's not possible," I said, and I heard how thin my own voice sounded, saying it out loud in that quiet office. I would remember signing away my entire financial life, Marion. I'm 71. I'm not senile. I know you, Vincent. I've known you 19 years, and none of this feels right to me either. But the document is properly executed. There's a notary seal, a witness line, everything the law requires of it. She turned the page toward me and tapped the small, embossed stamp in the corner. Notarized by a Perry Nash. Do you recognize that name? I didn't. Not then. The bank isn't at fault here, and legally on paper neither is Owen. Someone brought us a valid-looking, properly notarized document, and we processed it, exactly the way the law requires us to. But Vincent, I have to ask you plainly, because I have to ask everyone who sits in that chair. Is there any chance at all that you signed this and simply don't recall it? It was a fair question. It was also, I would come to understand over the following weeks, the exact question this entire scheme had been engineered to make people ask about me instead of about my son. "No," I said. Then, because some door in my mind had finally been kicked open by the word notarized, I said it again, slower. "No, but I think I might remember the moment they used to get it. I drove home in a kind of fog that afternoon, and it was somewhere on the Kennedy Expressway, stuck behind a jackknife delivery truck with brake lights bleeding red for half a mile, that the memory finally arranged itself in full, the way a blueprint resolves out of 100 scattered pencil lines the instant you finally see which wall is load-bearing. Thanksgiving, 8 months earlier. The house had been loud that year, in the good way. Lily's laughter ringing off the kitchen tile, the smell of Corinne's old sage stuffing recipe, which Bianca had insisted on making exactly the way my late wife used to, down to the extra pinch of nutmeg she always added at the last minute. I remember sitting in the living room with Lily curled half asleep against my shoulder, telling her the story about the tower I once designed that every engineer in the room swore would fall down, and never did. Bianca came rushing out of the kitchen with a small stack of papers and a pen, already uncapped, her voice bright and a little breathless, the voice of a woman juggling 6 things at once and asking for the smallest possible favor in the middle of it. "Vincent, I'm so sorry. Can you sign these real quick? It's just the life insurance renewal. Owen needs to mail it first thing tomorrow or the policy lapses. And Perry's actually here having dinner with us, so we might as well get it notarized right now instead of you driving somewhere next week." Perry. I remembered him now, a soft-spoken man in a gray cardigan, one of Bianca's co-workers from the HR department, who I'd simply assumed all evening was a family friend invited for the holiday out of kindness. He'd smiled at me from across the dining room table at one point, raised his wine glass in a small, easy toast, and I had smiled back and thought absolutely nothing of it. I hadn't put on my reading glasses. Lily was warm and half asleep against my chest. The turkey was resting under foil on the counter. Owen was topping off wine glasses. and the whole house smelled like the life I had spent 40 years building toward exactly these evenings. Bianca fanned the paper slightly the way you do when you want someone to see there's nothing to hide and nothing worth reading closely, and I signed where she pointed, page after page, barely glancing down, trusting my daughter-in-law completely in the warm, unguarded center of a family holiday I never once thought to be suspicious of. Somewhere in that innocent little stack, tucked, I would later learn, exactly 3 pages deep, sandwiched between 2 genuine insurance forms so the paper felt consistent and unremarkable under my thumb, was the power of attorney that had just quietly taken over my entire financial life. They hadn't broken into my house. They hadn't forged anything, not in the technical, easily prosecutable sense of the word. They had done something far more surgical and far more monstrous. They had used my own trust, my own unguarded love for my granddaughter, my own grief-softened gratitude that Bianca still cooked Corinne's stuffing every single year as the exact instrument of the theft. A notary they'd hand-picked and seated at my dinner table. A moment they'd engineered down to the wine and the warmth. A stack of papers thick enough that one page could hide comfortably inside 2 others. A betrayal, wrapped in the sweetest possible sugar, served to me on Thanksgiving, at my own table, by my own family, while I held my granddaughter and told her a story about a tower that refused to fall. I sat in that stalled traffic on the Kennedy for 11 minutes without moving an inch, not because the road ahead of me was blocked, but because for the first time in my adult life, I genuinely did not know which direction home was supposed to be. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I didn't go inside. I sat in the car and made 2 decisions, one right after the other, with the same cold clarity I used to bring to a failing structural calculation on a job site. The first was that I would not call Owen tonight, or tomorrow, or confront him at all. Not yet. The second was that I needed a lawyer who specialized in exactly this kind of theft. Not a family friend, not someone who would soften the truth to spare anyone's feelings, mine included. I picked up my phone and typed 3 words into it that I never imagined I would need in my 71st year. Elder financial abuse attorney. Near the top of the results, with a 5-star rating and a photograph of a sharp-eyed man in his 60s who looked like he had spent 30 years refusing to be the last person told, was a name that would become, over the following 6 months, the only person on this earth I trusted completely. Douglas Pratt. I called his office before I'd even let myself back out of the car, and when his assistant asked what the consultation was regarding, I found I could barely say the words out loud for the first time. My son, I said finally, has stolen my life, legally. There was a pause on the other end, brief and professional, the kind of pause that told me this woman had heard some version of that sentence more times than I wanted to know. Mr. Pratt has an opening tomorrow morning at 9, she said. Bring every document you have, bank statements, the power of attorney, if you can get a copy, anything with a date on it. I have the copy already, I said, looking down at the folder on the passenger seat, still warm from Marion's printer. Good, she said. Then you're already ahead of most people who call us, Mr. Holbrook. Most people call after the house is already gone. I sat with that sentence longer than I probably should have, engine ticking as it cooled in the driveway, the porch light Corinne and I had installed together 30 years ago, glowing yellow against the early evening. Somewhere inside that house, in a drawer in my study, was the eulogy I'd written for my wife 3 years ago, in which I had promised, out loud, in front of everyone we loved, that I would spend the rest of my life the way she taught me to, with my eyes open, my ledger balanced, and my name meaning exactly what I put it to. I intended to keep that promise, whatever it cost me. Douglas Pratt's office looked nothing like I expected from a man who came so highly rated online. No glass conference table, no skyline view, no assistant offering espresso. Just a cramped room lined floor to ceiling with case files, a window unit air conditioner rattling in the corner, and a desk covered in the kind of organized chaos that told me this man had spent 30 years in the trenches of exactly the war I had just been drafted into. He read through everything I brought him without saying a word for almost 20 minutes. The copy of the power of attorney, my bank statements, the notary stamp, my scrawled notes about Thanksgiving. When he finally looked up, his eyes had the flat, unhurried focus of a man who had stopped being surprised by families a very long time ago. "This is a textbook case," he said, "and I mean that in the worst possible way. Financial predators inside a family almost never look like criminals, Mr. Holbrook. They look like helpful sons, helpful daughters-in-law, people who show up to every holiday and never miss a birthday." He tapped the notary stamp with one finger. The fact that they used a real notary, someone connected to Bianca professionally, tells me this wasn't improvised. This was planned, probably for months before that dinner ever happened. "So what do?" I asked. "I want to walk into Owen's office tomorrow morning and put this on his desk." "Then you will lose," Douglas said flatly, without a trace of softness in it. "The moment they realize you know, they will do one of two things, possibly both. They will destroy or alter records we haven't secured copies of yet, and they will start building a narrative, quietly, to friends, to your doctor, to anyone who will listen, that you're confused, that you're paranoid, that grief has finally caught up with you. People believe that story easily, Mr. Holbrook, because it's a comfortable one. It doesn't require anyone to think badly of a son who brings his father dinner every Sunday." I felt something cold settle into my stomach. "You're telling me to do nothing. I'm telling you to do the opposite of nothing. I'm telling you to become the single most patient man in this city." He leaned forward, forearms on the desk. "Right now, your son believes he's already won. That belief is the single most valuable asset you have. A man who thinks he's already won stops being careful. He gets sloppy. He talks more than he should in front of more people than he should, because winners don't feel the need to whisper. Your job for the next several months is to let him keep believing it." I didn't like it. Every instinct in me, the same instinct that had once made me stand in front of 40 engineers and refuse to back down on a load calculation everyone else swore was wrong, wanted to fight this in the open, immediately, loudly, in daylight. But I had learned a long time ago on job sites that the instinct to fight immediately usually belongs to the man who hasn't yet counted his enemy's numbers. So I went home and I began the hardest performance of my 71 years. I let Bianca remind me to take my blood pressure medication at Sunday dinner, in the particular tone people use for children who might forget. I let Owen check in before I bought so much as a new set of chisels for the woodworking bench in my garage, thanking him afterward, as though he'd done me some genuine kindness rather than granted permission for me to spend $80 of my own money. I stopped correcting them when they spoke about me in the third person while I was sitting 3 feet away, which was, without question, the hardest part of all, sitting silently while my own son told his wife, "He seems okay today," about me, as though I were a piece of weather, to be monitored, rather than a man with 40 years of engineering judgment still fully intact behind his eyes. One Sunday, an old colleague of mine, Harlan Boyce, spotted me at the hardware store, loading bags of wood filler into my cart, and asked, half joking, when I'd finally gotten a chauffeur. I laughed along with him and said something about Owen just being thoughtful. I didn't tell him that Owen had texted twice that morning asking what, exactly, I needed the wood filler for, as though a lifetime hobbyist required a permission slip to patch a birdhouse. The requests kept growing, the way they always do once nobody pushes back on the first one. Bianca began asking in her breezy, half-joking way how much I still kept in checking versus savings, whether any CDs were coming due soon, whether Corinne and I had ever properly updated our beneficiary forms after the funeral. At the time, I'd taken these for the idle curiosity of a daughter-in-law who worked in HR and simply thought in spreadsheets. Now, with the leather notebook open on my desk each night, I understood them for exactly what they were: reconnaissance, delivered in the friendliest possible tone, 3 questions at a time, never enough at once to alarm anyone, always enough, over 6 months, to build a complete map of everything I owned. Owen started too in his own way, mentioning offhand at dinner how much upkeep the house must be for one person, how nice it might be for me to have less to manage, how Bianca's cousin had done wonderfully at a retirement community 2 towns over. I would nod along, agreeable and slightly wistful, exactly the man they had already decided I was becoming, and I would write every word of it down before I went to bed, because Douglas had taught me that a pattern is only visible once you stop reacting to each thread individually and start looking at the whole weave. Every night after the house went quiet, I sat alone in my study with the door locked and a leather notebook Corinne had given me years ago for sketching building concepts, and I wrote down everything. Every condescending sentence, every time Owen spoke to me like a liability on a balance sheet instead of his father, every small casual cruelty dressed up as concern. I dated each entry. I wrote exact wording wherever I could recall it, because Douglas had told me, in that flat, unhurried voice of his, that vague memories don't hold up in a courtroom, but specific, dated, consistent documentation does. The pain of it wasn't in the money. I want to be very clear about that because I think people who haven't lived through this assume it must be about the money, and it never was, not for one single day. $400,000 is a number. It doesn't ache at 3 in the morning. What ached, what genuinely physically ached, somewhere behind my sternum, every single night I sat in that study writing by lamplight, was the theft of something no attorney could ever put a dollar figure on. My own son had decided quietly and without ever once asking me that I no longer deserved a voice in my own life, that my 71 years, my 40-year career, my marriage, my grief, my still sharp mind, all of it, could simply be filed under managed and set aside like an inconvenient line item on somebody else's spreadsheet. There was a Sunday, about 6 weeks into the performance, when Owen sat across from me at dinner and said entirely without malice, entirely believing he was being kind, "You know, Dad, it's really been so much better since we simplified everything for you. You seem more relaxed." I remember setting down my fork very carefully, the way you set down a tool you're afraid you might use wrong if your hand isn't steady. "I do feel different," I told him, and it was, in its own strange way, the most honest sentence I said to him in 6 months. Bianca smiled at that, genuinely pleased, and reached over to refill my water glass without asking, the same way you'd top off a child's cup. I smiled back at her across the table, and underneath the tablecloth, my other hand rested on my knee, perfectly still, exactly the way I had trained it to be every single Sunday for 6 months. Later that night, writing the entry for that Sunday, I found myself pausing over the sentence, "You seem more relaxed for a long time," before I finally set the pen down. I wasn't relaxed. I had simply stopped fighting where they could see me fighting, and somewhere along the way, my own son had mistaken my silence for peace. It was, I realized, the exact same mistake he'd made with the power of attorney itself, assuming that because I hadn't objected out loud, I had never noticed at all. Upstairs, the leather notebook kept filling, one dated entry at a time, building steadily toward a night neither of them would ever see coming. It was Toby who finally cracked something open in me that 6 months of quiet, careful patience never had. Toby is Owen and Bianca's youngest, 8 years old, missing his front tooth, entirely incapable of understanding why anyone would ever keep a secret from someone they loved. He was in my garage one Saturday afternoon, sitting on an overturned bucket while I sanded down a birdhouse for Lily's treehouse, chattering the way 8-year-olds do about school and soccer practice and a video game I didn't understand a word of. Then, without any change in tone at all, as though he were telling me the weather forecast, he said, "Grandpa, Mom said pretty soon you're going to move into a really nice place with other old people, and Dad's going to turn your room into a gym. Does the place have a pool?" I kept sanding. I made myself keep sanding, in fact, with the same steady, even pressure I'd used 100 times before, because I understood, even in that moment, that my hands were the only part of me capable of staying honest without giving anything away. "I'm not sure yet, buddy," I said. "We'll have to see." "I hope it has a pool," Toby said, already losing interest, kicking his sneakers against the bucket legs. "Dad says the gym's going to have a rowing machine. Can I use it?" "We'll see about that too," I said, and I meant neither answer, and he didn't notice, because 8-year-olds rarely go looking for the seams in an adult's voice unless something has already taught them to. He shrugged, entirely satisfied, and went back to asking about the video game, some story about a character who had to rebuild a broken bridge to save a village, and I nodded along and finished sanding the birdhouse and told him it looked good enough for Lily now, and he ran off toward the house to find his sister, and I stood alone in the garage for a long moment with the sander still humming in my hand before I finally switched it off. A really nice place, with other old people. My grandson had said it the way children repeat things adults have said so often, and so casually, that the phrase has already worn smooth, like a stone handled every day until nobody remembers it was ever sharp. I didn't sleep that night. By 6 the next morning I was in my car, and I drove to Douglas Pratt's office and sat in the small parking lot outside until the lights came on inside, and I walked in without calling ahead. "They're planning to move me out," I told him. "My 8-year-old grandson just told me, more or less by accident, that Owen wants to turn my bedroom into a gym." Douglas didn't look surprised, which somehow unsettled me more than if he had. "I need you to hear something, and I need you to sit with it before you react," he said. "I had an investigator quietly pull property listings connected to your address last month as a routine check. Your house went up for a confidential pre-market listing 11 days ago. Realtor's name is on file. No public listing yet, nothing your neighbors would see, but it's real, and it's moving." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "My house isn't for sale. I never authorized that. You didn't have to. Under a durable power of attorney with real estate authority, Owen doesn't legally need your signature to list it, only to close on it. And there's more." He slid a printed email across the desk, one I would later learn had been forwarded to my investigator by a source inside the realtor's own office who'd found the whole arrangement uncomfortable enough to say something. "Owen has also been in contact with a psychiatrist named Dr. Alan Rourke twice in the past month. The subject line on this one says it plainly: Capacity Evaluation, Vincent Holbrook." I sat very still. "They're not just planning to move you into a facility, Vincent," Douglas said, more gently than he usually spoke. "They're building a paper trail to have you formally declared incapable of managing your own affairs. If they succeed, it doesn't matter what you know, what you remember, or what you can prove about the Thanksgiving forgery. A court-ordered finding of incapacity would end this fight before it ever really starts, because a man the court has declared incapable isn't considered a credible witness to his own life." I thought of Corinne's face and the coffee cup she used to hold with both hands, the way she said, "Whoever holds the money writes the rules." I understood finally in Douglas Pratt's cramped office, with the window unit rattling behind him, exactly how far that rule extended. It wasn't only about money anymore. They intended to write me out of the story entirely. "Then we stopped being patient," I said. "No," Douglas said, "we stopped being slow. There's a difference, and it's the difference that's going to win this for you." He pulled a fresh legal pad toward himself. "We build something they cannot undo, and we build it faster than they're building their case against you. A new revocable trust, funded immediately with the house and every liquid asset we can move before that listing goes public. A new will, and most importantly, a formal, notarized revocation of the existing power of attorney backed by an independent capacity evaluation from a geriatric physician of our choosing, obtained before Owen's psychiatrist ever gets his hands on you. How fast can we move?" "As fast as you can get to Dr. Eileen Marsh's office. She's testified in 41 capacity hearings in this county and never once been successfully challenged. We get her evaluation on record this week, we file the revocation the moment it's signed, and we build what I'm going to call, for lack of a better name, an ironclad trust, something so thoroughly walled off from any single family member's control that it doesn't matter whose signature anyone forges next time, because there won't be anything left to sign for. And the house listing? We can't undo what's already circulating quietly among realtors, but we can make it irrelevant. The instant the house sits inside an irrevocable trust with an independent trustee, Owen's power of attorney has no authority over it at all, forged consent or not. He'd need the trustee's signature, not yours, not even a court's, unless he can prove fraud on our side. And there isn't any. Douglas capped his pen and looked at me directly. I want to be honest with you about something else, Vincent. This will feel for a while like you're the one being deceptive, like you're the one keeping secrets from your own family. I need you to remember every single day this takes that you didn't start this. You are simply the first person in this story to finally stop being lied to quietly. I sat in that chair a long time after he finished talking, thinking about the 8-year-old boy on the overturned bucket, asking, entirely without malice, whether the nice place with other old people had a pool. Somewhere in this last 6 months, my own grandson had already absorbed the story his parents were telling, not out of cruelty, but out of the simple, terrible ease with which children believe whatever the adults around them say with confidence. That was the moment I stopped being afraid of what fighting back might cost me, because the real cost, I finally understood, wasn't losing the house, or the money, or even the fight itself. The real cost was letting Toby grow up believing that this was simply what happens to people once they get old, that love quietly turns into management, and management quietly turns into disappearance, and nobody with power ever has to answer for it. I called Dr. Eileen Marsh's office from the parking lot outside Douglas Pratt's building and got an appointment for Wednesday morning. I called Marion Hayes next and asked her very calmly to begin preparing the paperwork to move every liquid asset she legally could into a new account structure the moment I gave the word. And that evening, sitting once again in my locked study with the leather notebook open in front of me, I wrote a single entry, shorter than any of the others. They are moving faster than I thought. So am I. I closed the notebook, turned off the desk lamp, and for the first time in 6 months, I slept the entire night without waking once. I dreamed of all things about the tower, the one with the cantilever every engineer in the room had once sworn would fail. In the dream, I was standing on the observation deck near the top of it, and Toby was beside me, small and unafraid, looking down at the city the way children look at anything enormous without ever doubting for a moment that it would hold. I woke before sunrise with that image still sitting in my chest, and for the first time since the toy shop, I understood exactly what I was building toward. Not revenge, not even justice, not really. Just a structure strong enough that no one I loved would ever have to fall through it again. I invited them to dinner on a Sunday in April, exactly the way I had invited them to dinner every Sunday for 6 months, and I made sure my voice sounded exactly the way it always did on the phone. Tired, agreeable, grateful for the company. "Bianca's bringing that lemon chicken you like," Owen said. "See you at 6, Dad." What he didn't know, because I had spent 6 months teaching him not to know anything about me anymore, was that by 5:30 that evening my dining room would already be full. Douglas Pratt arrived first, in a gray suit I had never once seen him wear in his cluttered little office, carrying a slim leather portfolio. Behind him came a woman named Renata Cole from the bank's fraud investigation unit, who Marion Hayes had personally vouched for, and finally a man named Wesley Trent, an investigator from the county's Adult Protective Services Division, whose quiet, unhurried manner reminded me, oddly, of Douglas himself. I set 5 extra places at my table that evening, and I put Corinne's good china out for the first time since her funeral, because whatever else happened that night, I wanted it to happen somewhere she would have recognized as home. "You understand this is your last easy exit," Douglas said to me quietly, while Renata Cole arranged her papers at the far end of the table, and Wesley Trent stood by the window looking out at the darkening street. "Once that door opens, there's no version of this evening where things go back to comfortable. I stopped wanting comfortable 6 months ago," I told him. "I want the truth on the table before I die, Douglas. That's all I've ever wanted out of any of this." He nodded once, the way you nod at a load calculation you've already checked twice and trust completely, and he took his seat at the end of the table nearest the kitchen, where he could watch the whole room at once. At 6 o'clock exactly, the doorbell rang. I opened it myself. Owen was mid-sentence, laughing about something with Bianca beside him, a dish of lemon chicken balanced in her hands. The laugh died somewhere in his throat the moment he saw past me into the dining room, where 4 strangers in professional clothing met waiting in complete silence around a table set for company. "Dad," Owen said slowly, "what is this?" "Sit down," I said. "Both of you. Dinner's getting cold." They sat, because 6 months of training a person to obey without question apparently works in both directions. Bianca's hands were trembling slightly as she set the lemon chicken down in the center of the table. On top of the tablecloth, Corinne had embroidered the year Owen was born. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that because I had imagined this moment for months, and in every version I'd imagined I was shouting. But when it actually arrived, I found I had no interest in shouting at all. Shouting would have meant I still needed something from them. I didn't, not anymore. I reached beside my chair and set the leather notebook on the table, followed by a manila folder containing a copy of the Thanksgiving notary log, the power of attorney, and the pre-market real estate listing Douglas's investigator had pulled 11 days after it was filed. "6 months ago," I said, "you consolidated my accounts and told me it was safer for everyone. That same week at the bank, I learned that months before that a power of attorney had been slipped into a stack of insurance forms at my own Thanksgiving table, notarized by a man from your office, Bianca, while I was holding my granddaughter and had no idea what I was signing. 11 days ago, my house went up for a confidential pre-market listing. I never authorized it. And 3 weeks ago, Owen, you contacted a psychiatrist named Dr. Alan Rourke to begin building a case that I lacked the capacity to manage my own affairs." The color drained out of Owen's face in stages, like watching a building lose its lights floor by floor during a blackout. "Dad, I can explain." "You can?" I said. "That's exactly why I invited you to dinner, instead of having Mr. Trent show up at your office with a subpoena." Bianca found her voice first, the way she always did, reaching for the same tone she'd used 100 times over the last year. "Vincent, everything we did because we love you. You've been forgetting things. You've seemed lonely since Corinne passed. We were only trying to help you manage everything more efficiently." "Efficiently," I repeated. I let the word sit on the table between us for a moment, the same way Douglas had taught me to let evidence sit before I explained what it meant. "My lawyer has already filed a formal complaint with the county's Adult Protective Services Division, and Mrs. Cole here has flagged the account activity with the bank's internal fraud unit as a criminal matter. Financial exploitation of an elder carries a penalty in this state of up to 5 years in prison, Bianca. That's the efficiency you built for me." Bianca's composure finally cracked, tears rising fast and genuine, though I found I could no longer fully tell the difference between the tears she meant and the tears she'd learned over the years to produce on command. "We never touched your money. We never took a dollar. Intent doesn't require you to spend it," Wesley Trent said quietly, speaking for the first time all evening, his voice carrying the flat, procedural calm of a man who had said this exact sentence in 100 other dining rooms. "Establishing unauthorized control over an elder's assets through deception or undue influence is itself the offense, regardless of whether funds were withdrawn." Owen put his head in his hands. When he lifted it again, whatever composure he'd walked in with was entirely gone. "Dad, please," he said, and his voice cracked on the word please in a way I hadn't heard since he was 9 years old, and had broken the antique clock in Corinne's study and confessed to it, sobbing, before I'd even noticed it was missing. I never wanted to hurt you. I told myself I was protecting you. I told myself you were slipping, and if I didn't step in, someone worse would. Nobody worse was ever coming, Owen, I said, and for the first time all evening, my voice did shake, just slightly, on the word Owen. There was only ever you, and instead of asking me, instead of sitting at this table and simply asking your father whether he needed help, you decided for me. You wrote me out of my own life and called it love. He was crying openly now, the way I hadn't seen him cry since Corinne's funeral, and some small, stubborn part of me, the part that had rocked him to sleep as an infant and taught him to ride a bicycle in the very driveway outside this window, ached at the sight of it even now. But I had learned something in 6 months of writing in a leather notebook by lamplight, something Corinne had tried to teach me years before I was ready to hear it. Love and mercy are not the same thing as permission, and a man can forgive his son completely while still refusing to hand him the keys to anything ever again. Bianca reached across the table then, not toward me, but toward Owen's hand, and for a moment the gesture almost looked like tenderness, before I remembered how carefully she had always known exactly which gesture to make in front of which audience. "Vincent," she said, her voice lower now, stripped of its earlier polish, "if you press charges, it destroys him, his career, everything he's built. Is that really what you want at the end of all this?" I looked at her for a long moment before I answered. "What I want," I said, "is for my son to understand that love, without asking permission, isn't love at all. It's just control wearing a nicer coat." I turned to Renata Cole. "What happens next if I choose not to press criminal charges?" "That's entirely your decision to make, Mr. Holbrook," she said. "The bank's internal findings remain on file regardless. Whether the county pursues a criminal case depends on Mr. Trent's report, and in cases like this, often on the wishes of the victim." "Then I won't press charges," I said, and I watched something like relief flicker across Owen's ruined face before I finished the sentence. "Not because you've earned mercy, Owen, because your children still need a father, and I refuse to let this family lose 2 generations to one man's mistake. But mercy isn't the same thing as trust, and I want both of you to understand exactly what happens to trust once you've spent it the way you spent mine." "I'm not finished," I said, and I reached for the second folder beside my chair, the one containing the new trust documents, already signed, already filed, already entirely beyond anyone's reach at this table. "There's one more thing you both need to hear before dessert. The house, the retirement accounts, and everything else I own," I said, "are now held inside an irrevocable trust, managed by an independent professional trustee with no personal stake in this family. It was signed and funded 3 days ago, which means it existed before either of you walked through that door tonight." I slid the final document across the table, watching Owen's eyes move over the trustee's signature, a name neither of them recognized, which was, in its own way, exactly the point. "If I ever genuinely lose my capacity," I continued, 2 independent physicians, not family, not anyone with a stake in my estate, will make that determination. If I die, the remaining assets pass to a charitable fund I've established in your mother's name, not to either of you directly, unless the trustee determines, at that future date, that trust has been rebuilt. Not promised. Rebuilt." Bianca stared at the document like it might rearrange itself into something more forgiving if she looked long enough. "You cut us out completely. I removed your ability to make decisions for me," I said. "That isn't the same thing as cutting you out of my life, Bianca, though I understand why. Tonight, it feels exactly the same to you. You will still be at every holiday. You will still be Toby and Lily's mother, and I will still love you the way I've loved you since the day Owen brought you home for the first time. What you will never have again, either of you, is the authority to decide quietly and without asking, what is good for me." Owen wiped his face with the back of his hand, a gesture so much like the 9-year-old boy who'd broken Corinne's clock that something in my chest ached despite everything. Dad, I know sorry doesn't undo any of it, but I am. I really am. I believe you, I said, and I meant it, which surprised even me. I don't think you woke up one morning and decided to become a thief, Owen. I think you woke up 100 separate mornings and made 100 separate small decisions, each one easier than the last, each one wearing the costume of love, until one day you looked up and discovered you'd built something you never would have agreed to if I'd shown it to you all at once, whole, on the very first morning. That's how it always happens. Nobody sets out to become this. They just stop asking questions, one Sunday at a time, until the silence starts to feel like permission. Nobody at the table spoke for a long moment. Outside, I could hear the neighbors' sprinklers ticking on in the early evening dark, the most ordinary sound in the world, going on exactly as it always had while everything inside this house had just permanently changed shape. Wesley Trent closed his notebook and rose to leave, pausing at the edge of the table to shake my hand. I've sat at 100 tables like this one, Mr. Holbrook, he said. Most of them end quieter than this. Fewer of them end this honest. He nodded once to Owen and Bianca, not unkindly, and let himself out into the evening. There's one more thing, I said, and for the first time all evening something almost like warmth came into my voice. I've started a foundation in your mother's name, the Corinne Holbrook Fund. It's going to run free financial literacy workshops at the public library downtown, teaching people my age how to recognize exactly what happened to me, how a power of attorney works, what undue influence actually looks like when it's wearing a family's face instead of a stranger's, how to protect the very trust that people like you, Owen, so easily exploit in people like me. Renata Cole spoke up from the end of the table, her professional reserve finally cracking into something like genuine feeling. The bank would be glad to send a fraud specialist to those sessions, Mr. Holbrook. We see this exact pattern more often than the public would ever believe. So would our office, Douglas said. I'll teach the estate planning session myself. I looked around that table, my lawyer, a bank investigator, a county caseworker, my sobbing son, my silent daughter-in-law, and the empty chair where Corinne would have sat, laughing at how thoroughly her old kitchen table had turned into a courtroom. And I thought, not for the first time that year, that grief and justice sometimes travel through the exact same door. The months that followed were not easy, and I won't pretend they were. Trust does not grow back simply because someone says the word sorry with enough tears behind it. It grows back slowly in small actions repeated often enough to mean something. Owen started calling before he visited, instead of simply appearing at my door with news I hadn't asked to hear. He asked before he assumed, about everything, from the tools in my garage to the woodworking classes I started teaching at the community center that autumn. Bianca sent a handwritten letter, not an email, admitting that she'd grown up believing efficiency and love were the same instinct wearing different names, and that watching her own mother struggle after her grandfather's decline had taught her, wrongly, that taking over sooner was always kinder than asking. It wasn't an excuse. She never asked me to treat it as one, but it was honest, and honesty, I'd learned that year, was worth more to me now than almost anything else a person could offer. The Corinne Holbrook Fund held its first workshop that October, in the same public library where Corinne used to volunteer reading afternoons for children twice a month. 41 people showed up for a session that had room for 25, and Douglas ended up standing the whole 2 hours because every folding chair in the room was taken. I watched an 80-year-old woman named Ruth Feldman take careful notes on a legal pad, asking sharp, precise questions about durable versus limited powers of attorney, and afterward she found me by the coffee urn and told me quietly that her own daughter had been asking similar questions about consolidating accounts, and that she finally understood, watching my slides, exactly what those questions might actually mean. I gave her Douglas's card before she left. I have thought about her often since. Owen came to that first workshop too, sitting in the back row without announcing himself. And afterward, he told me it was the hardest 2 hours he'd sat through in his life, hearing his own family's story summarized in clinical detail as a cautionary example for a room full of strangers. I told him that was exactly why I'd asked him to come. Some lessons only take root once you've had to sit in the audience and watch yourself become the warning. A year passed. Almost to the week, I found myself back in that same honey-lit toy shop, holding a wooden castle set for Lily's 8th birthday, standing at the same register where all of this had begun. The same cashier was working, a little older now, and she smiled when she recognized me. "Third time you've bought that castle set," she said. "Must be a popular birthday around here." "You have no idea," I said, and slid my card, my own card, in my own name, under my own sole authority, across the reader. The machine blinked green. Approved. I walked out into the spring sunshine with the little blue-wrapped box under my arm, and Toby was waiting by the car, 9 years old now, a new gap in his teeth already growing in, already talking about a video game I still didn't understand a word of. He climbed into the back seat and asked, entirely without malice, entirely the way children ask about anything they've simply always assumed to be true, "Grandpa, are you going to live in your house forever?" I looked at him in the rearview mirror, at the whole easy, unguarded trust of him, and I thought about how close I'd come to losing the right to answer that question for myself. "For as long as I want to, buddy," I said. "And that's the whole point." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his game. And I pulled out of the parking lot and drove us both home. My home, still mine, exactly as it should have been all along. If this story reminded you of someone you love, a parent, a grandparent, or even a version of yourself you're afraid of becoming one day, I hope you'll carry Vincent's lesson with you the way I've carried it with me. Growing older is not surrender. Needing help is not the same as needing permission. And if you truly love someone, you don't quietly take the wheel out of their hands. You sit beside them, you ask what they need, and you honor whatever they tell you. If this story moved you, subscribe for the next one, and tell me in the comments, at what moment would you have finally stopped staying quiet?